Okay, so today we're going to be talking about a new resource that I've been working on for the past year called the Hudson Dynamic Shorelines Story Map Collection, and I hope it will be useful to all of you. So it's a pretty simple agenda today. I'm going to talk for 10 minutes about the project background. Then we're going to jump into the story map collection, and I'm just going to walk you through it. And then the last 15 minutes, I'll let you know what the next steps are, and we'll have time for questions. So this project was funded through a cooperating technical partnership with FEMA Region 2. It was formed on July 2020. And the goal of the CTP, or Cooperating Technical Partnership, is to strengthen and enhance the National Flood Insurance Program through FEMA's Risk Map program. And the main goal for the Risk Map program is to deliver quality data that increases public awareness and leads to action that reduces risk to life and property. So what I have in bold there is kind of the goal, the overarching goal for the funding for this project. Our project fell into communication and outreach strategies. And when we started this partnership, it was decided that this first round would focus on the Hudson and Long Island. So that's the map you see there. And I worked with my colleague, Kathleen Phelan, who's the coastal processes specialist down there. And so it was kind of interesting. We both have slightly different, I would say very different areas of focus and very different geographies, but we basically worked together through all of this and created our own story maps for each of our regions. And it was great. I thank Kathleen for a really fun working relationship. So as we were deciding what this project would be, we were asking around and trying to gauge what was needed in each of our regions. And so we've kind of framed our problem as there's a lack of general education about natural shoreline and watershed processes that can lead to decisions that exacerbate flooding and erosion over time. Community members, municipal staff are not always aware of the why during planning processes and when we provide technical assistance and recommendations. And that's through no fault of their own. They're not expected to know all this stuff. But just acknowledging that there's not always time for that. And then finally, there's, even if you do work with people closely, there can be turnover of municipal staff. And so this is really meant to be a resource that can be referred to, and a lot of people can refer to over time. So based on that, our project goal was to provide this easily accessible information that frames shoreline management and local development from a systems view and considers climate change impacts. And then a few other factors were that all this happened when we were doing our scope of work and starting the CTP back in April and May of 2020. So there was a ton of uncertainty about what was happening. Would we be able to work closely with people? So that's why we decided to make an online resource. I think in future years, we'll probably do more engagement related activities. It's always a challenge to present information in an engaging way. I know in the Hudson, there's so much good work happening in the resilience space that one of my challenges was to create something that would support all that was already happening, that would complement it. We had a short time frame, 1 year. And I was also new to the region at the beginning of this project. I had been there a little over 6 months, so I was learning things every day. And I'm coming up on my 2-year anniversary next week, which is hard to believe. So the components of this project, we did a literature and resource review at the very beginning, just to understand what was out there and what we would want to highlight. We conducted a kind of a mini needs assessment. We held some focus groups with our audience. Our final deliverable is a story map collection, and I'll talk more about that in a second. This project had some branding and advertising components just because it's like, we're going to make this online resource, then how do we get people to it? And then I also wanted to mention that this underwent extensive review with colleagues, practitioners in the region, and it morphed a lot over time. So the reason we chose a story map collection is it's kind of a relatively newer technology. You can be really flexible with your storytelling. We divided ours into chapters based on the way we wanted to organize information. And it has some really useful and engaging functions like interactive maps, slideshows, just to like switch it up a little bit. You can embed other resources and can be kind of self-referential. So in a later chapter, if we're providing a solution, we can refer back to an earlier chapter that says, you know, why it's a good solution for the problem. It's accessible for the online format, and it actually looks pretty good on a mobile phone. And it's really easy to update. I was making updates this morning. So I'm going to talk really quick about the needs assessment. I'm not going to go into all the results today, but the reason we did that was just to get a chance to hear from the target audience. And the target audience was shoreline decision makers, so people that live, the property owners on the Hudson Estuary shoreline and the tidally influenced tributaries, and local officials and staff from those communities. We also talked to some what we called influencers, which are the consultants, realtors, engineers that work directly with these decision makers. I ended up having 2 virtual focus groups and 1 interview, 10 participants total, so not a lot, not enough to be like generalizable at all. But I got 4 residents, 4 officials, and 2 water-based businesses. And then Rensselaer, Orange, and Putnam counties were not represented, but other than that, I was able to get fairly good range over the estuary. And the questions we asked, they were open-ended questions about risk and hazards of living and working along the shoreline and what people are doing to cope. So for the branding and advertising component of this, we created this postcard. It's like a 5x7. We're printing a bunch, and these can be distributed in person or through the mail, or they can be passed around. And oh, could someone mute? I'm getting some feedback. And so I will send these to everybody after this call, and you can just save it to your computer and you can have it there for the future. And this is the back of the postcard. It goes into more detail on what each chapter is about. And there's like a bit.ly link for each one. And I should show on the front, this is the link that I'm about to put in the chat. And we have a QR code as well. And then real quick, Kathleen, we got these logos that kind of joined all the New York Sea Grant regions together. Mine's representing the Rondout Lighthouse. Kathleen's is the Montauk Lighthouse down in Long Island. And then the Great Lakes are going to do their own version of this story map. They're going to replicate the process that we did in this upcoming year. So we'll have kind of a series for New York. And note that these logos are not finalized. So you might see some changes in the future. Okay, so with that, I'm going to head over to the story map collection. If Kathleen could put the link in the chat for people, that would be great. And then if you hold your phone up to this QR code, you should be able to access it there as well. Okay. So this is the landing page for the story map collection. And here's my 4 chapters. The first one is land, water, and people. This is that systems view of flooding and erosion. And the purpose is to give an overview on how water flows across the land and how it's changing with climate change. So it's organized into these sections about watersheds, floods and floodplains, wetlands and forests, what's changing about the water cycle, and then a floodplain management 101 section with some resources at the end. So I'm just going to scroll through this. I'm not going to spend time on reading any of this right now, but I just wanted to show that at the end of each section, there's kind of this key takeaway message that summarizes everything before it. There is one interactive map in this story map, and it's locate your subwatershed and your floodplain. And to put the floodplain on there, I used the special flood hazard area that was derived from FEMA firms, and it's from 1996. It's what was on the New York State GIS Gateway. And it's good enough for this exercise where we're just drawing people's attention to where the floodplain is in their community. So I have lots of caveats about that. And then some questions to explore for people. So find out the name of your subwatershed. What do you notice? How close are you to the floodplain? Where in the watershed does your drinking water come from? Is it surface or groundwater? And then where are your wastewater treatment facilities? Are they going to be impacted by sea level rise? So here's the map, and it takes a minute to load sometimes. There we go. It includes the names of water bodies as well. But the idea is you enter in your location here and you can start exploring your community. So the next section goes into more detail on what are floods, what are floodplains. And I'm just going to scroll through this quickly. We've got riverine flooding, pluvial flooding, and coastal flooding. And then a whole section on wetlands and forests. And I lean very heavily on the estuary program's land use and conservation team for this information. And this just talks about the importance of wetlands for water storage, slowing down water, filtering water, that type of thing. I linked to the Scenic Hudson Protecting the Pathways story map here. And yeah, I'm just going to scroll through this and let you explore it on your own time. I've also included some case studies, again, straight from Laura Heedy, about demonstrating the value of ecosystem services. An example from the Charles River Watershed, and then tidal marsh as flood protection. The section on changing waters covers precipitation and sea level rise. I did go into a lot of detail on sea level rise because I've heard a lot of questions and misunderstandings from stakeholders. So I just wanted to put it all right here, kind of the global and the regional impacts or reasons for sea level rise. And then finally, this floodplain management 101 section that details, that links all of this together. All this is kind of building on each other, and it talks about how floodplain management can impact, or why you need to think on a watershed scale, the role of floodplains, wetlands, and forests, and what it all means for our changing climate. Another cool thing about story maps is they have these links here, so you can actually throw this link into an email to someone or whatever, or bookmark it, so it'll take you exactly to that section, so you don't have to scroll through. And this goes over flood insurance rate maps. What is the floodway and flood fringe? How do you find them on a map? And then these key messages about the limitations of firms and the special flood hazard area, 100-year flood, and base flood elevation. And then each section ends with resources. Oh, sorry, my mouse is going crazy. And then at the end of each one, we also have this feedback survey, but I'm going to put an evaluation survey at the end of this webinar for today. So don't take that one yet. Okay, so the next one goes into more detail on water-related natural hazards in the Hudson Valley, and then the tools that you can use to understand your individual and community risk. So we talk about natural hazards, heavy downpours, big storms, both tropical storms and nor'easters, coastal floods in terms of storm surge and high tide flooding. There's a section that gives a slideshow on the significant storms to date. This is just to jog our memories, and also for people that are new to the Hudson Valley, they can get up to speed on things like Hurricane Irene and Superstorm Sandy. The National Weather Service just released a story map on the impacts of Irene, and that's embedded here, as well as a video on the superstorm. And then I also included the Christmas snowmelt flood of 2020, just because that was a significant event. You know, Ida could be something that I add into here, and you know, maybe other storms going forward, just to get across that it's not even just these big ones that can have a big impact to communities. So this impacts to communities section is the preliminary results from the focus groups that we did. And so the way this is organized is, for now, it's just into these three major themes that people talked about, which is the financial impacts. There's a quote there. Environmental impacts and recreational impacts. And this is really just to highlight the voices of stakeholders, just so that it's not just that, you know, technical language coming from New York Sea Grant, I guess. And that section will be finalized in the future. So for the tools section, we link to, we talk about regulatory flood maps as well as flood factor, a newer tool. And there's a lot of discomfort with recommending flood factor to people. So I tried to caveat that a lot. And I created this graphic of how flood factor and FEMA regulatory maps can be used as complementary products, and outlining the primary purpose and the pros and cons of each. Because regulatory flood maps do not consider climate change, so flood factor could potentially fill that gap if you can, you know, keep in mind the limitations. I've linked to our sea level rise viewers. The Flood Resilience Network created this comparison sheet for them. We're lucky to have, you know, 2 regional mappers. The Department of State recently released their Hudson River composite risk areas. So that's linked here, as well as the Neighborhoods at Risk tool, which is a social vulnerability and climate exposure tool. And I'm actually going to be hosting the creators of this tool at a webinar on November 12th. If you're interested in learning more about this tool specifically, I hope to start advertising for that soon. And then there's just some resources at the end. I'm going to move on to the Living with Floods chapter. So the first 2 are more of like the background, the kind of the story of what's going on, a little bit doom and gloom. And then the later 2 chapters are more what you can do about it and resources. So in Living with Floods, Living with Floods, we're talking about, you know, what is resilience? What is risk? How do we use it to understand how to prioritize actions? We talk about vulnerability, environmental justice as part of all this, and then approaches for assessment, with this idea that there is no one size fits all approach, and communities can often leverage different planning processes and funding sources to achieve this. And shout out to Libby and Liz, who helped me articulate this and are doing a lot of work in this area. So this ways to take action section is broken up into floodplain management, infrastructure, and planning, with this emphasis that New York is a home rule state. And so, you know, one of the strongest things that you can do to increase resilience for your community is through legislation at the local level. And so I've kind of sprinkled the 5 different chapters for model local laws, the CARA model local laws throughout this section. So a little bit about floodplain management and infrastructure, noting that, you know, the structural control methods are proving to not be as effective over time, and they were not built for climate change. A little bit on green infrastructure and some of the planning processes that you can use to become more resilient. And then a note on comprehensive planning. My favorite part of this one is these case studies. And I know there's not a lot on this map right now. I have a lot drafted. I just couldn't finalize them in time for this webinar, but that's okay. We're going to keep adding to this over time. But it's just a map that shows what people are doing around the estuary for resilience. So examples like better risk communication through this Catskill Municipal Flood Guide. There's higher regulatory standards, this cumulative substantial improvement that, you know, they adopted up in Shandaken. This is great because there's the actual code is listed here. And for these case studies, it also lists the climate smart communities actions that these can count towards. So we've got local flood engineering analysis as a type of risk assessment, riparian vegetation restoration through the Trees for Tribs program, stream crossing management and culvert plan, and culvert replacements, excuse me, through the estuary program. Green infrastructure project down in Rockland County. That's, you know, turning some like asphalt surface into a stormwater retention wetland. Daylighting the Sawmill River. And then the ones that I'm going to add to this soon are, you know, an example of a really good NRI, open space plan, watershed scale, flood assessments, and the different sea level rise assessments or task forces that have happened over the years. And if you have a case study that you think should be included in this map, please reach out because I would love to include it. And like I said, just fill that map up with a bunch of projects. A section that breaks down the different programs, funding and support for people or for communities, including Climate Smart, CRS, LWRP, estuary programs, the Flood Resilience Network, and then some information on financing waterfront resilience. And then there's this section that's information for residents. So simple actions that homeowners can do to reduce flood damage. Kathleen actually made this graphic. Couple FEMA resources on retrofitting, etc. And then a section on flood insurance, the website, and some questions to help people understand exactly what it is, do they need it, etc. And then more resources at the bottom, including risk communication, equitable and inclusive planning, and then a few others. And then the last one, which is for devoted, you know, mostly to the actual Hudson shoreline, is best practices for the shoreline. So for this, we talk about the shore zone, we define it, and all of the physical forces that are acting on it. So, you know, waves, wind, ice. A lot of this information I got from the recently released flood resilience guidebook from the estuary program for public access sites. There's a section on how the shore zone has changed over time, because that actually influences a lot of what we can and can't do today. So there's a map that shows so that people can explore, you know, how much of their shoreline is hard engineered, how much is natural. It's not quite loading, that's okay. And then there's a section that talks about the legacy issues. So things like dredging, you know, that might mean your shoreline is more erodible because it's made from dredged material. The role of railroads and their relationship to the tidal wetlands. PCB contamination, because, you know, there's issues with dredging, what you can do in the river due to that. And, you know, a lot of waterfront communities have brownfield sites. And so what that means and the limitations there. The need to balance economic development with, you know, an eye towards climate resilience. And then options for adaptation. So there's the do nothing approach, conservation, you can elevate structures, and then managed retreat and relocation. Then there's a section on shoreline management that talks about all the different techniques from green to gray, including the model local laws related to that. We've got non-structural methods, hybrid or nature-based. Highlighting the Sustainable Shorelines project. This classic view of the Sopus Meadows shoreline. And then finally, structural methods at the end. And climate adaptive design. One of the things we heard from our focus groups was people really had a lot of difficulty with permitting. So Kathleen and I spent a couple months creating some, like a guide for permitting or some guidance for homeowners and just to demystify the process a little bit. But with this timeline, we ended up running out of time and we had to shelve it, but we're pretty far along and we're gonna complete that over the next year. And I think that'll be really useful for people too. So stay tuned for that. And then the rest of this story map is just linking to all the great resources that are already out there, from the Sustainable Shorelines Project to, you know, national guidance. And yeah, so you can explore that on your own time. So now I'm just going to hop back into this presentation really quick for a final slide. So our next steps with this project today was just kind of a smaller launch with a smaller group, because we ran into some snags with our graphic design and we were able to pivot and work around them. But that's the reason for like the smaller, you know, launch today. But I think it's ready. This is ready to be used. Please use it, share it widely, and incorporate it into your work however you need to. We were approved for phase 2 funding with our cooperating technical partnership. So we've got a longer time frame on that one. And what's in our scope of work for that is doing some Spanish translation for a Spanish version. We're going to expand the content. As I mentioned, getting that guide to permitting in there, more case studies. We're going to finalize our focus group data and also do a policy chapter on the recent statewide policies like CARA and the CLCPA and how that relates to resilience. We're also going to create some hard copies of this story map and like maybe like a printed toolkit, like a binder. A lot of this stuff can be probably turned into fact sheets, and maybe some self-assessments. And we are going to do a lot more outreach. So starting to kind of take this thing on the road, maybe present at you know, board meetings, CACs, whoever really wants to hear about this resource, or maybe just focusing on certain chapters if people are interested in that kind of thing, and then just continue to improve it over time. So with that, I'll just say thanks again for coming to this product launch today. There's so many people that helped with this project. And I just want to say thank you to all of them, including our project advisory committee and the people that reviewed, that sat with me on a Zoom or let me send them language to, like, you know, give me feedback on. it really, the story maps started out looking way different and way longer than it did at the end. And that's just because of all the input I got from other people. So thank you. And then thanks to our focus group participants and to the FEMA and their CTP program. So with that, I'll open it up for questions or discussion. If anyone has anything they'd like to learn. Oh, and actually, Kathleen, can you throw the evaluation in the chat? If you could please take our survey, that would really help us out to meet our project goals. I'll send it out afterwards too.
Are you taking verbal questions? I'll just say, I'll repeat what I said in the chat. This is really amazing. This is Fran speaking. I just think you did a really great job. I'm so impressed. So just thumbs up.
Thank you, Fran. Does anybody kind of see that how they could use this resource going forward or have ideas? If not today, you can always reach out and let me know.
I mean, I can't imagine not using that QR code on anything that we put out with climate education. It, you know, it makes it really easy to access, and for more information, it's so comprehensive, but also in working with municipalities, sharing it with them. I mean, it just, you know, definitely help spread this and do some outreach on behalf of the project. It's really great.
Awesome. Yeah. And I can also, I learned a lot about story maps and ArcGIS Online throughout this project. So I can also help people with those types of questions and whatnot. If you've been inspired and want to do a story map of your own, let me know. Yes, building departments referring new residents. That's actually what that was kind of our initial inspiration for those postcards. Like maybe they could be in a stack in a building department and people could hand them out. And we weren't sure how realistic that was. So I'm so glad that you mentioned that, Kathleen. And we'd be happy to drop the postcards off to anyone that wants them or mail them. Oh, awesome. Sharing it with a municipal board. That's great. That's exactly what we were hoping would happen. Cool. Well, I'm seeing a lot of feedback as I scroll through that seems to be positive. So thank you, everyone. I'm so glad that this looks like it's going to be useful. And if there's no other questions or comments, feel free to have the rest of your afternoon.
Be sure to get that recording out. I think there are people from our program who, a lot of them I see are already on this, but I'd like to have other people have a chance to see this that may not have known about it.
Absolutely. Yeah, in hindsight, I should have publicized this webinar more widely, but I can do that when we do our launch. I think it'll probably not be until the new year, like full press releases and all that, but I'll let you know when we post this and all that. All right, thanks everybody. I'm going to stop the recording now.